to thank you for the opportunity to give this share. I'd like to just start by acknowledging, first of all, to say thank you to all of you for joining us today from near and far, but to particularly thank Rabbi Shapiro and his wife, Rebbetzin Miriam, for joining us and for making a point of not missing any of my shiurim and asking for the source sheet and reviewing it and giving me corrections. It's really an honor. And to have my parents on the Zoom from Brookline, Massachusetts. So tonight we're going to talk about from obligation to celebration, halachic reflections on drinking on Purim. We all know that alcohol plays a really central role in Judaism. It's an important part of the ceremony of a Brit Milah. It's part of the Pidyon Haben. It's part of the marriage ceremony. It's part of Sheva Brachot. It has a role in Birkat HaMazon. It is of such significance that it has its own bracha before and after we drink it. We use it once a week. We use it on Shabbat, twice on Shabbat, and we use it for Havdalah. It plays an essential role in the Seder. However, and I will actually share my screen at this point. However, as much as Judaism values alcohol and recognizes the importance of alcohol, it also, we just have to get up to the beginning here. It also, just one moment, to the beginning. It also recognizes the importance of moderation. Eruvin Daf Ayin Amud Bet teaches that alcohol is one of 8 things, sheruban kasher umyutan yafeh, that in large quantities are difficult for the body, but in moderate quantities are good for the body. Yuma Daf Ayin Vav Amud Bet explicates the verse, Ayin Yismach Levav Anosh. Wine gladdens the heart of man. And the Gemara points out that if one drinks in moderation, then the wine is misameach. It brings joy. If one drinks to excess, it is mishamama. It destroys someone. And so Judaism very much frowns upon drunkenness. It prohibits drunkenness, which is a topic for another share and something that we have talked about in the past and will likely talk about again. But just to make this point, Rambam in Hilchot Deot, the 5th chapter, Halacha Gimel, states, "V'kol hamishtaker harei lechoteh u'meguneh u'mafsid chachmato." Anyone who gets drunk is a sinner and shameful and loses his wisdom. And so we see that Judaism very much values alcohol, but in moderation. It does not encourage us to drink to excess. It prohibits us from getting drunk. And yet, we all know the dangers of alcohol. We know the dangers of addiction. We know the dangers of binge drinking. We know the dangers of excessive drinking. We know that there are laws against drunk driving. There are laws against giving alcohol to minors. And yet, on one day of the year, Jews drink with abandon. We drink as if there's no tomorrow. We drink without responsibility. We drink beyond intoxication, and we drink with no age limits. And the question is this the halachic way? What does halacha have to say to us about getting drunk on Purim? And so it all starts with perhaps the most often quoted passage in the Gemara, Megillah Daf Zayin Amud Bet, source number 4. Amar Rava, Mefaya ve'ina shlibesume v'puraya, ad lo yada bein Arur Haman lebaruch Mordechai. Rava said, and people have an obligation to get drunk on Purim till they don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And so, based on that phrase, there's nothing more to talk about. It's very clear from Rava's statement that we have an obligation to get drunk on Purim, and we have an obligation to get really drunk on Purim to the point where we don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. And so, based on that statement, it would seem that's it. There's nothing more to talk about. Shir is over with. We can all go on to learn something else about Purim. We have an obligation to get drunk. But it's not that simple, because right after Rava's statement, the Gemara brings us the story of Rabba and Rabbi Zera. Rabba invited Rabbi Zera to his Purim Suda, and they got drunk. At some point in the middle of the Suda, Rabba got up, Come Rabba, shachte Rabbi Zera. He shechted Rabbi Zera. The next day, Rabba stood over Rabbi Zera's body and davened for him to come back to life, and a miracle occurred. He was resuscitated. The next year, Rabba invited Rabbi Zera again to his Purim Suda. And Rabbi Zera graciously declined. He said, I'm sorry, but miracles can't happen that often. Lo b'kol sha'ata v'sha'ata mitrachesh nisa. I'm not going to hedge my bet. I'm not coming. And so the question is, why do we drink wine on Purim? What is the relationship between the story of Rabba and Rabbi Zera and Rava's statement? What actually happened at their Purim Suda? And do we bring Rava's statement, lahalacha? And so the first question, why do we drink wine on Purim? So the Abu Dharam, Rabbi David Abu Dharam from 14th century Seville, explains that we drink wine on Purim because all of the nisim that took place on Purim took place in the context of wine. Vashti fell from power in the context of a mishter where they were drinking wine. Esther rose to power in the context of a mishter where they're drinking wine. Haman's downfall occurred in a mishter where he was drinking wine. And so we drink wine to remember as a zecher for all of the great miracles that took place on Purim as a result of wine. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, however, offers a different explanation. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach states that we drink wine on Purim, we get drunk, because at the time of the miracles of Purim, it was right after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and it was impossible for the Jewish people to experience true joy, true simcha, after this terrible calamity. And so we drink wine on Purim because we're incapable of having true joy at this point in our lives. We wait for the Geula Shalema, and we pray for the Geula Shalema, because at that time we won't need wine anymore. We won't need to get drunk to achieve true joy. We will have it through the Geula. And he says, when we wish someone Purim Sameach, we are wishing to them that they should be worthy of the full simcha of Purim that we will have in the time of the Geula. And that explanation actually really speaks to us right now, to this year and last year, when it seems so difficult to find true joy, given the challenges that are surrounding us. But what happened at the Suda? What really happened with Rabba and Rabbi Zera? So the pshat, the simplest explanation based on the text of the Gemara is that, in fact, Rabba shechted Rabbi Zera. He slaughtered him, and somehow Rabba davened for him, and he came back to life. But the Marsha offers a different explanation. He says Rabbi Zera suffered alcohol poisoning from drinking too much wine, from excessive drinking, and that Rabba stood over his body and davened for his refuah. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has a different explanation. He says that Rabba humiliated Rabbi Zera, because in halacha equates halbanat panim, embarrassing someone, to murder. It's a type of murder. It is tantamount to murder because it destroys their soul, it destroys their nefesh. And so regardless of what actually happened at that Suda, whether Rabba shechted Rabbi Zera, whether Rabbi Zera suffered alcohol poisoning, whether Rabba humiliated Rabbi Zera, the story demonstrates the dangers of alcohol, dangers to those who get drunk, dangers to those who are around them, both to their physical health and to their emotional health. And so the question is, What does this story about Rabbah and Rabbi Zera at their Purim Suda do to Rava's statement, does it discredit Rava's statement or does it affirm it? So according to the Ran quotes Rabbeinu Ephraim ben Yitzchak of Regensburg, who states, Mehahu Uda, to come Rabba v'shachte l'Rabbi Zera, idchele memar de Rava, v'lo shapir dami lama hachi. That the fact that Rabbah got up and shechted Rabbi Zera discredits Rava's statement, and it is not okay to do what Rabbah suggested, to get drunk. However, Sefer HaEshkol, Avraham ben Yitzchak of Narbonne comes to the opposite conclusion. He concludes that actually the story of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera affirms Rava's statement, Why? Because Rabbah and Rabbi Zera sat down and got drunk together. And so if the story was coming to discredit Rabbah's statement, then they should have had a Purim Suda that was alcohol-free, or at the very least, didn't lead to getting drunk. And so what we have is 3 different schools of thought, 3 different approaches to getting drunk on Purim. The first is that it's an absolute obligation to get drunk. This is the position of the Rif, it's the position of the Torah, and the position of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Torah writes in Orach Chaim, Siman Tafresh Sadik Hey, mitzvah laharbot b'sudat Purim, v'sarich sheyishtaker ad shelo yeda bein Aror Haman leBaruch Mordechai. Very simply, it's a mitzvah to get drunk on Purim at the Suda, and until the point where you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and and blessed is Mordechai, no restrictions, unrestricted drinking. The Shulchan Aruch seems to reach the same conclusion. Again, one is obligated to drink on Purim until the point of not knowing the difference between cursed is Haman and Baruch Mordechai. The Bach concludes that the story of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera actually affirms Rabbah's statement because, again, they used wine and they got drunk. And he goes so far as to suggest that one has an obligation on Purim not only to get drunk, but to reach a state of intoxication that is karov l'shichruto shel lot, close to the level of intoxication of lot. So much so that one should not be able to speak before a king. So we're talking about a very, very high level of intoxication. However, we're now going to begin to see a bit of hesitancy among the poskim, a reluctance to be able to say, we should get as drunk as could be, completely wasted, close to the level of drunkenness of Lot. The Pri Chadash, Rabbi Chizkiah de Silva, who wrote over 300 years ago, said halacha is according to Rava. Yes, chayvin shel b'sumei b'puraya. However, umihu ata shahata rot l'kul kalim ra'oi litfos svarat Rabbeinu Ephraim v'shalo lishtot elam ma'at kat yoter mimash merugal b'yom tov v'zeh yotzei yedei chavato kevan shekavanato l'shamayim k'dei shalo likashel chas v'shalom b'shum mikra ra. So he says, you know what? Our constitution isn't like that of the Amoraim. We can't drink as much. And so, yes, the halacha is, according to Rava, that there is an obligation to get drunk on Purim. But today we have to follow the position of Rabbeinu Ephraim and not get drunk and just drink a little bit more so that we won't fall and we won't violate prohibitions and we won't get into trouble from drinking. And so that is the first school of thought, that yes, there is an obligation to get drunk on Purim. How drunk? Perhaps as drunk as Lot, perhaps less. However, the second approach is a middle road position. It's a more moderate position, that it's a mitzvah to get drunk, but not an obligation, and perhaps not so drunk. And so the Rambam says, כיצד חובת סעודה זו שיאכל בשר ויתקן סעודה נאה כפי אשר תמסה ידו ושותה יין עד שישתכר וירדם בשפלות. That it's a mitzvah to drink and get drunk and then fall asleep from being drunk. And the implication is that you will reach a state by falling asleep drunk. That's how you will achieve Ad Lo Yada, because you'll be asleep and you won't know the difference between Aurora Haman and Baruch Mordechai. And Hagot Maimoniot points out to Kol Hani LeMitzvah Ba'alma V'lo La'akev, that it's a mitzvah to get drunk. However, it is not an obligation. And how do we achieve? How do we achieve this level of drunkenness? It's not as bad as, it's not as extensive as being a karov l'shichrut lot. So the Abu Dharam explains that either we're so drunk that we're at some level of drunkenness or intoxication where we can't do the gematria of Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, which for most people is probably isn't very high level of intoxication to do that math, or that you get mixed up in a piyut, in a special Purim song, which has refrains. But then again, we're not completely intoxicated. And the Ramah kind of codifies this middle position into law. The Ramah writes, "V'yesh omrim de'enot tzarich hishtaker kol kach, ela sheyishteh yoter milimudo, v'yishan umitoch sheyishan eno yodea bein Arur Haman leBaruch Mordechai, v'chad hamarbeh v'chad hamamit bilvad shechaven libo l'shamayim." You don't need to get that drunk. He's actually commenting on the Shulchan Aruch statement, Chayavin Shlevasume B'Puraya, that one is obligated to get drunk on Purim. Ramah qualifies it. No, you don't need to get that drunk. Just you should drink a little bit more and then fall asleep. And once you're asleep, you won't know the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. And one may drink a little more, one may drink a little less. But the point is that their drinking should be l'shem shamayim. And so we've seen that there is a position that there's an obligation to get drunk. We've seen that there's a middle position, that it's a mitzvah, but not an obligation, and that perhaps one does not need to reach such a high level of drunkenness. And then we have a third position, that it's an absolute prohibition to get drunk. And this is the position of the Meiri. The Meiri writes, "Chayav adam laharbot b'simcha b'yom zeh u'b'achila u'b'shtiya ad shelo yachaser shum davar mikol makom ein anu mitzuvim lehishtaker u'lahafchit atzmeinu mitoch hasimcha shelo nitztavenu al simcha shel hololut v'shel shtut ela b'simcha shel ta'anut shenagia mitocha la'ahavat Hashem v'hoda'al al hanisim she'asa lanu." He says that there is a mitzvah to be happy on Purim and to eat and drink and to not lack for anything. But we are not commanded to get drunk or to degrade ourselves out of simcha, that we were not commanded to have simcha of licentiousness or debauchery or lightheadedness, but a simcha that comes from pleasure. And through it, we'll come to love Hashem and recognize the nisim that He has done for us. The Sefer Kolbo is in this position, is also in this camp, that it's asur to get drunk. The Sefer Kolbo was written by an unknown author. It's possible that it was written by Rav Aaron HaKohen of Lunel in his first draft of Orchot Chaim, which we will see, which we'll read in a few moments. And the Sefer Kolbo says, again, Lo sheyishtaker shehashichvut isur gamor ve'ein lecha ve'ra gdola mizu shehu gorem legilui arayot v'shvichut damim l'kama averut zulatan ach sheyishteh yoter milimudo ma'at כדי שירבה לשמוח ולשמח האביונים וינחם אותם וידבר על ליבם וזוהי השמחה השלמה. No, the simcha of Purim is not to get drunk, because getting drunk is an absolute prohibition. There is no greater sin than this, because it leads to illicit relations, it leads to murder, it leads to other sins. Just one should drink a little bit more than usual, and that way he will become happy and maximize his joy, and he will make the poor people happy and he'll comfort them. And that is how he achieves true simcha, through his comforting and rejoicing the poor. And so people who say, well, I'm getting drunk on Purim because it's a chiyuv. Shulchan Aruch Chaim Siman Tav Reish Tzaddik Hey Seif Bet says Chayavin Shlevasume B'Puraya. It's a mitzvah to get drunk on Purim, and there's no qualification, so I'm getting drunk. Well, that approach is a little disingenuous, because in the Beit Yosef, where the Rabbi Yosef Karo expands upon his position, he brings several opinions, but only the opinions that say that it's usher to get drunk. He brings the Ran, who quotes Rabbeinu Ephraim that it's usher to get drunk. And then he brings the Orchot Chaim, again, who echoes the Kolbo, which is not surprising considering that it's possible it was written by the same author, that it's a sore to get drunk. There's no greater sin. It brings us to many sins, to illicit relations, to murder, and that we should just drink a little bit more. And so to understand the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Kara's position, is not enough to just quote his position in the Shulchan Aruch. We also have to take it in the larger context of what he says in the Beit Yosef and try to reconcile those two opinions. Something that, as you will see shortly, poskim struggle with. The Taz concludes that the fact that the story about Rabbah and Rabbi Zera follows Rabbah's statements indicates that the Gemara itself rejects Rabbah's statement. And then we have the Aruch HaShulchan. Oh, sorry, before we get to the Aruch HaShulchan, I would just like to point out that in their ambivalence about the obligation to get drunk, we have a very interesting position from the Marsha. The Marsha makes a statement based on a Gemara, Bava Metzia, Daf Kaf Gimel Amud Bet, that permits a Talmid Chacham to lie under three circumstances, and one of them is Puria. The Marsha concludes that a Talmid Chacham may actually lie on Purim and say that he has reached a state of Ad Lo Yada when he hasn't, which is a very interesting statement and suggests that the peer pressure that we experience today to drink, especially on Purim, probably existed in the time of the Marsha, and that it is so difficult to deal with it that one can even potentially lie to get out of having to drink if they're not comfortable doing so on Purim. However, we still have this tension within Rabbi Yosef Kara's position, and we really see this tension and the struggle to resolve it in the Aruch HaShulchan's position, in Rabbi Yechiel Michael Epstein's position. So in Seif Daled, he talks about Ad Lo Yada, and he tries to define what it is, and then he quotes the Hagot Maimoniot that we saw earlier, that it is a mitzvah and not to hold us back, not an obligation. And he says, V'yesh l'mar sheyesh l'faresh, m'chayev inish l'masumei, klamar dezehu chiyuv al kol echad ad shelo yada, klamar v'rashut biyad hashoteh lishtot ad lo yada. Devadai ein kol bnei adam shavim b'zeh, v'omer dehachiyuv al kulam kol echad l'fi madregato v'rashut ad lo yada, afilu im shoteh ad lo yada v'lo nig'or bo. So he says, I'm not sure how to interpret all of these different opinions. Maybe when we're talking about Ad Lo Yada, it's that everyone drinks a different amount, and if you drink more, you drink less, it's okay. As someone who drinks too much, we're not going to criticize him. But then in the next Seif, he said he quotes the Beit Yosef, and he says, I'm baffled. Here we have the Beit Yosef, who quotes the Orchot Chaim, that there's no greater sin than getting drunk on Purim, and that we should just drink a little bit. V'kasheh, d'im kain, mein ad lo yada. V'im mafaresh ke'eza perush nitbar, ech satam rabbeinu habeit Yosef t'varav b'shulchan aruch. V'lehed yamashma shichrut gmura, v'sarich iyun. V'ulai yafarsho, ad lo ad bichlal, u'l'maaseh yesh lihitrachek min hashichrut, v'prat shtiyat yayin v'shechar, shebishikruto, Yitmale ki tzo'av v'rak lishtot ma'at yoter milimudo v'lishon tzat. He says, I don't know what to do with these statements. I have in the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo brings the Orchot Chaim that there's no greater sin than getting drunk. But then in the Shulchan Aruch, he says all he says is Chayav inish l'basume, no more detail. And it sounds like you should really get full on drunk. We need to clarify this. And he suggests maybe what Rabbi Yosef Karo really meant was that we drink ad v'lo ad bichlal. We drink just before we should drink just before the point where we don't know the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, but that we should avoid getting drunk, and we certainly should avoid drinking whiskey because it causes people to vomit and be covered with feces. Even though among those who say there's an obligation to get drunk on Purim, They qualify this statement. It's not unlimited. There are parameters. It doesn't always apply. So the Biur Halacha, the Chafetz Chaim, quotes the Chachmad Adam that who explains Va'omnam hayodea ba'atzmo sheyizalzel az b'mitzvah min hamitzvot b'netilat yadayim u'bracha u'berkat hamazon o shelo yitpalel mincha o mariv o sheyinhog kalut rosh mutav shelo yishtaker v'chol ma'asav yiyu l'shem shamayim. He quotes the Chachmad Adam that, okay, there is an obligation to get drunk on Purim. It's to reflect all of the nisim that took place with alcohol, with wine on Purim itself. But someone who knows that if he gets drunk, getting drunk is going to interfere with one of his mitzvot. He's not going to be able to perform the Tilat Yadayim, Birkat Hamazon. He's not going to be able to daven Mincha Marv, or he's going to act in a lighthearted, disrespectful manner. It's better he should not get drunk, and all of his actions should be l'shem shamayim. The Sharei Tshuva, who was Chaim Mordechai Margoliot, wrote that yes, it's a chiyuv to get drunk, but not if mishahu chalash b'tiv'o, someone who is weak in his nature, or someone who knows that he is not going to behave properly should abstain from getting drunk. The Leket Yoshar, a Talmid of the Trumat Hadeshen, writes that someone who knows that alcohol is going to harm him should not drink it. And Rabbi Yisrael David Harpanis, a contemporary Haredi posek from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, writes that someone who does not like the taste of wine is patur from the obligation to get drunk on Purim, because for him the wine is sar, it's painful. So we see a whole number of qualifications to the obligation to get drunk on Purim. There's no obligation if it causes you harm. There's no obligation if it's going to cause you to, it's going to interfere with the performance of mitzvot. It's going to lead to violation of prohibitions. If you don't like the taste of wine. The Admor Mislonim, Rav Shlomo Noah Barzovsky, wrote that it's usher to get drunk on Purim because there are too many mitzvot of Purim that require dat. They require presence of mind. They require a clear head. We talk about Purim kiyom kippurim, and we talk about Purim as a time of kimu v'kiblu, that we took on mitzvot. And it's not possible to do those things if one is flat out drunk underneath the dining room table. And so he learns this, that really it's usher to get drunk on Purim from Rava's language. He explicates his language. He says it's not by accident that Rava said chayev inish levasume b'puraya. It's that one must get drunk on Purim. He did not say chayev inish levasume b'yayin, that one has an obligation to get drunk with wine, but b'puria, with Purim, to indicate that we have an obligation to get drunk with joy from Purim itself, from the mitzvot of the day, from our connection to Hashem on that day, and to the recognition and realization of the many nisim and niflaot that Hashem did for us on this Chag. Shmuel Kamenetsky also says that it is usher to get drunk. How does he deal with chayev inish levasume? How does he interpret levasume? He says levasume is a whiff. You should take a smell of alcohol. And so we've seen a whole range of opinions on whether or not one has an obligation to get drunk on Purim, ranging from, yes, there is an obligation to get drunk almost as close to the drunkenness of Lot. We've seen the hesitancy of poskim, the difficulty they have with a potential obligation to get drunk or even that drunk. We've seen that they've qualified that statement. We've seen a middle ground position that says it's a mitzvah to get drunk, not an obligation, and maybe not that drunk. And then we've seen the position that there is no obligation at all, that it's an absolute sin to get drunk on Purim. But what about special populations? What about children? Parents have an obligation for chinuch, to lechanech their children, to prepare them for performing mitzvot when they reach gil mitzvot. Is there an obligation of chinuch in the mitzvah of chayev inish levasume? And Rav Moshe Sternbach, Shuvot Hanhagot, answered no. And he learns this from a pasuk in Megillat Esther, Perek Tet, pasuk Kafchet. V'yemei ha'purim ha'elu lo ya'avru mitoch ha'yehudim u'zichram lo yasuf mizaram. The pasuk talks about two things: Yemei Purim, which he says is the Mishteh, which would include the mitzvah of Chayavin Shabasume, and that mitzvah applies to Yehudim, to the adults, and Zichram applies to Zaram. The Zecher part of the mitzvah of Purim applies to their children. And so from this, he concludes that there is no mitzvah of chinuch to teach your child how to do the mitzvah, assuming that there is a mitzvah or a chiyuv of getting drunk on Purim, that it does not apply. There's no element of chinuch to that, but there is an element of chinuch to the zecher part of the chag, which is reading Megillah and making sure that your child participates in that mitzvah. What about children who have reached Gil Mitzvot? What about teens? So over the last several years, the OU has issued a statement. The OU, in conjunction with the NCSY, has issued a statement for zero tolerance of alcohol on Purim for youth, for teens. And it has received a lot of pushback and criticism for this statement. And the question is there halachic justification for this position? After all, the Shulchan Aruch says, he says one is obligated to become drunk on Purim. And he doesn't say just those over age 18. And he doesn't say just those who have, the truth is that the dangers of alcohol in youth don't end at age 18. The brain continues to develop till age 25, and Rabbi Yosef Karo does not say Chayavin Shabasume from age 25 and over. So how can the OU exempt teenagers and young adults? Well, their statement's only for teenagers, but how can it exempt young adults from this mitzvah, Chayavin Shabasume? And so Rabbi Chaim Jachter, a Rebbe at Torah Academy of Bergen County and a Dayan of the Beit Din of Elizabeth, wrote an extensive defense of the OU's statement. First, in answer to the question, how can, if we had these halacha for thousands of years, what's different? How can the OU go and come out with a different approach? And the answer is that the world has changed. And today we have automobiles, which didn't exist in previous generations, and those put our children in particular danger on Purim. But he also adds that there is an element of pikuach nefesh, and we know that pikuach nefesh overrides virtually every other mitzvah except for 3, and it overrides any potential mitzvah or obligation there might be to get drunk. And there certainly is an element of pikuach nefesh to getting, for our youth, to getting drunk on Purim, because we know that even a one-time alcohol binge of drinking can be dangerous. A one-time binge can lead to accidents. It can lead to injuries. It can lead to unsafe sexual behavior. It can depress the immune system. It can lead to alcohol poisoning. We saw Rabbi Zera, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, suffered alcohol poisoning, and it also can damage the pancreas, lead to pancreatitis, especially with someone who has underlying disease in their pancreas. The CDC reports 178,000 deaths each year, attributes 178,000 deaths to excessive drinking or drinking too much alcohol, and 1/3 of those deaths occur from a single episode of excessive drinking. So there are dangers to a one-time binge, and it is not unreasonable to define this as pikuach nefesh. There's also the element of dina d'malchuta dina, the halachic principle that the law of the land is the law of the land, that we have an obligation to follow the law of the secular prevailing government. And the law in the state of Massachusetts and the state of Florida, I believe, is that one may not purchase alcohol till they're over age 21. One may not provide alcohol to someone until they're over the age of 21. In Israel, it's age of 18, and so drinking on Purim flies in the face of secular law. But we also know that when a secular law conflicts with halacha, the halacha prevails. And so one could argue that in this case, Chayav Inish L'Besume would trump secular law. But, however, poskim argue that when a secular law was constructed for public safety, or was a law that we would have instituted on our own, then the secular law prevails. And Rabbi Jachter argues that if we had a Sanhedrin today, the Sanhedrin would prohibit teens from drinking alcohol. And so that's something important to keep in mind on Purim when we have, or even in the days leading up to Purim. This Shabbos is Shabbat Zachor, and many of our children will go to their yeshivas for Shabbat Zachor, where they will be served massive quantities of alcohol. And it's something for our educators to keep in mind, and something for us to keep in mind as a community when on Purim, when we have alcohol readily available at our homes or in our Batei Knesset. And then he argues that one of the tshuvot you've already seen, the Biur Halacha, that if the Biur Halacha says that if getting drunk will interfere with the performance of a mitzvah, it's asur to get drunk. And clearly, getting drunk interferes with a teen's ability to fulfill the mitzvah of V'nishmartem ma'od l'nafshotechem. He also argues that there is halachic precedent for exempting teens from certain mitzvot that require extra maturity, extra responsibility. He points out why are teens not obligated to get married? Why doesn't the mitzvah kick in, the obligation kick in until one reaches the age of 18? Because they don't have the maturity. He quotes the Ramah, who brings an opinion in Yesh Machmirim that doesn't allow someone to do shchita until the age of 18. And he also quotes a Shulchan Aruch that an opinion that one may not, a Talmid Chacham may not serve on a Beit Din until the age of 18. Again, examples of other mitzvot from which a teen is exempt because they lack maturity. What about women? Are women obligated for those who believe that there's an obligation to get drunk on Purim? Do women have such an obligation? And so the sources that you've seen until now do not address this issue at all. But we could kind of argue in our heads one side or the other. So on the one hand, we would say, Afhein hayuboto hanes, women were in the same nace, women have the same obligations in the mitzvot of Purim as men have, with possible exception of reading the Megillah, which is a topic for another shir on its own, but they have the same obligation. At the same time, the Rava's statement is Chayav Inish L'Besume. Maybe the obligation is only upon a man. Maybe it doesn't apply to a woman, or maybe Inish means everyone. And so poskim really didn't weigh in on this until very recently. The Shevet HaLevi ruled that it is asur for a woman to get drunk. He bases this on a Gemara in Ketuvot, which the Shulchan Aruch brings the halacha that a husband, when he provides a woman with her daily food allotment, if she lives in an area where it's a local custom to drink alcohol, to drink wine, must provide her with wine, but only a small amount, even in his presence, because women typically did not drink large amounts of wine. And so Rav Wosner concludes that a woman may not get drunk because it will cause her yetzer to yetzer to strengthen. The Rav Moshe Sternbach concludes that also prohibits a woman from getting drunk on Purim, saying Ein derech nashim b'shikrut, that it's not the way of women to get drunk, and it's the isur gamor she'eina nahug etzlan gam nishteh va'alulim lavo al la'averot chamurot. that women should not get drunk, since it will lead to a great number of severe sins. And then the Revavot Ephraim weighed in on this. Revavot Ephraim is Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt of Memphis, Tennessee, my husband's 6th, 7th, and 8th grade Rebbe, who wrote an extensive tshuva on getting drunk on Purim for women and prohibited it. He offered multiple arguments. One of them is that part of the reason we get drunk on Purim is to erase our desire to destroy Amalek, and women aren't part of the mitzvah to destroy Amalek. He also raises the argument that it is not bekavod for a woman to make a bracha on the wine, kol kvoda bat melech pnima, that it's really not bekavod for a woman to drink in public, even if it's just in front of her family. That really the mitzvah of drinking on Purim is not to get drunk, it's to drink a little bit more, but not to get drunk. And women aren't able to do that. They don't know how to drink a little without becoming drunk. And ein derech nashim lehishtaker. It's not the way of women to get drunk. Rav Melamed says that it's a mitzvah for a woman to drink wine, but she should not get drunk. And because there are issues of sniut, and he brings the Gemara from Ketubot to support his statement. And so, although some of these arguments and whether a woman is obligated to get drunk, or it's permitted for her to get drunk, or it's usher for her to get drunk, there is some medical basis for these statements. We actually know that if a man and woman drink the same amount of alcohol over the same amount of time, the woman is more likely to get drunk than the man, and there are physiologic reasons for this. Women have lower concentrations of the enzyme that metabolizes alcohol in our stomachs. It has to do with differences in our fat composition, has to do with differences in the percentage of water in a woman's body compared to a man's body. The dangers of alcohol are greater in women because they're more likely to develop damage to their liver and pancreas from alcohol. They're more likely to have elevated blood pressure from alcohol. And we know that domestic violence, sexual assault, or just violence in general are more likely to occur when there's some alcohol on board. So regardless of whether it's permitted or prohibited, there's special considerations when it comes to a woman. So to sum it up, if someone asked you, does halacha say I have an obligation to get drunk on Purim? The answer is, it depends. It depends on who you ask. We've seen a broad range of opinions, some that there is an absolute obligation to get drunk, to reach a very high level of drunkenness. We've seen some hesitation, maybe not that drunk, not if it's going to lead to the violation of prohibitions, not if it's going to lead to cause us to miss out on performing important mitzvot, not if it's going to make us sick, not if it's going to harm those around us, not if we don't like the taste of alcohol. We've seen a middle position, more moderate position to drink more, get drunk, fall asleep, and not know the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai because we're sleeping. And then we've seen the position that there's absolutely no obligation, it's usher to get drunk on Purim. And there are a range of opinions, and it's particularly, I think that there's room for a wide range of approaches. It's especially important to be sensitive to those around us. There may be people around us who are struggling with alcohol addiction, and for them, drinking on Purim would certainly be usher, and for them, Purim may be one of the most challenging days of the year. So to be sensitive to that issue as well. And whether you're in the camp of it's an absolute obligation to get completely drunk on Purim, or a more moderate approach of drinking a little bit more, getting drunk at a lower level, or that it's usher to get drunk on Purim and I'm just going to drink a little more than usual. It is my hope that this year in particular, we are able to achieve true simcha, that we are able to become drunk with happiness over Purim itself, not drunk from alcohol, but from Purim itself, and the nisim and niflaot that Hashem did for us and does for us. And I wish everyone Purim Sameach in the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach sense of Purim Sameach. May we be worthy of true simcha of Purim, a simcha that does not require alcohol, a simcha of Geula Shalema. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Very insightful.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you for joining. Purim
Wait,
Sameach.
I do have one question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Just given the current, the latest kind of research regarding alcohol at all being more dangerous than we ever thought and causing possible other issues of health, serious health risks and all that, does that change the way, some of the halacha may view the drinking? Like, in other words, smoking wasn't considered so terrible when Rav Moshe Feinstein gave his psak, that maybe it could or couldn't be. But today, I think everybody would assur smoking in terms of pure halacha, because it is a risk to your health. So is there any discussion of that?
Esty, you have asked the most brilliant question. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but around the beginning of January, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a new statement describing the dangers of even moderate amounts of alcohol. For many, many years, it was believed that moderate amounts of alcohol were beneficial to the heart, and that a glass of alcohol a day, a glass of wine a day would prevent heart disease. My brother, the cardiologist, has said that he would recommend that to his patients. But we now know that the carcinogenic effects of alcohol are so dramatic that they can't justify preventing heart disease. And the studies that showed that moderate amounts of alcohol were protective against heart disease have not proven to be substantial. And so the World Health Organization now recommends no alcohol. It no longer recommends moderate. It says no amount of alcohol is safe. And the U.S. Surgeon General would like to change the recommendations for even moderate amounts of alcohol, and wants to put warning labels on alcohol the same as the warning labels on cigarettes. That alcohol is a known carcinogen, which really might change the conversation. And maybe that 15, 20 years from now, we may be looking back on Tshuvot that talk about getting drunk, or Tshuvot even talk about moderate amounts of alcohol in halacha, the same way we look back at Rav Moshe Tshuvot for smoking and say it no longer applies based on the science. We're not there yet. I haven't seen a single posting or anything written in response to the U.S. Surgeon General's report. If anyone knows of it, please send it my way. I would love to see it. Alcohol is very different than smoking. Alcohol is even more entrenched in society than cigarettes were in the 1970s or the 1950s. Alcohol is part of religious ritual observance. Cigarettes never were. So it is possible that that poskim will eventually treat cigarettes the way they treat alcohol. But to do that, we'll have to negate an entire Masorah of using alcohol even in moderate amounts. And really the question is, how dangerous is it to have a cup of wine for Kiddush once a week? Those studies haven't been done either. But I did see what's very interesting and speaks to your point, Esty, an article, I can't remember which, CNN, is alcohol the new smoking? And it may be from a medical perspective, and it could actually be from a halachic perspective.
Thank you. Maybe you'll be writing the first psak on that.
We'll see how that goes.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for your share.
Anyone else? All right.
Laila Tova, Freilich Purim without wine even.
Freilich.
מה שחשוב להבין, כלכלה, אחרי שזעזע את השווקים עם הטלת המכסים